Okay, everyone, we're just about to get started. So thank you. And we get wonderful, perfect. All right, everyone here ready? All right, so let me go ahead and introduce myself to everyone. My name is Katrina Spencer. I'm the librarian for African American and African Studies here at the University of Virginia. You can refer to me using either she or they pronouns. We have a fine panel for you today that's called Beyond Achebe Adichie. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the premise. I think two of the maybe most recognized names when it comes to African literature are Chinua Achebe and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in present day. And I think that they both have masterful works to provide to the canon of literature. And the question that we want to propose is what goes beyond those two titles or those two authors? When we offer African literature in the United States, frequently those names populate the canon, but we want to know about what is the next step? What do we do to go further beyond that? So we're going to talk about some of the trends in the field and some of the things, some of the structures that might be obstructing progress in that field. So we have three panelists here with us today, and I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. We're going to record the first 60 minutes of our talk, and then we're going to have 30 minutes of questions and answers for discussion. Okay? So we are going to start with you, Ukamaka, if you can introduce yourself to everyone in the virtual room and in the physical room.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for the technical stuff. All right, so my name is Ukamaka Olisakwe. You can call me Uka. I am the editor and founder and chief. By the way, I use the she, her pronouns. I am the editor and founder and chief of Iskanchi Magazine. So we're fairly new and it's been an amazing journey. And also thank you so much for inviting us, I and Isela, to be part of this panel. I am also affiliated with the University of South Dakota, where I am a PhD candidate. I recently passed my PhD final exams. So, thank you. So I'm on my way to my dissertation to officially call myself a doctor. So yeah, that's everything you should know about me. And on this side also, I'm also a novelist and a short story writer. So thank you for having me here. Yeah.
Next up, we've got Kenechi.
Hi, my name is Kenechi Uzor, and I'm a publisher I'm with Iskanchi Press. We are a new press. We just published our first 5 books in October 2022. We are publishing only African literature. All kinds of works really, so long as they are of quality and by African writers. We are based in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I teach at University of Utah. I teach writing at University of Utah.
Gene.
I'm Gene Kanneberg Jr., he, him. I'm a research and media assistant at the Herskovits Library of African Studies at Northwestern University in Edmiston, Illinois. I am here kind of from the library side of things. Pretty much, we at the Herskovits Library, our mandate is to collect everything written from or about Africa. So we are trying to collect things in all languages, all languages from Africa and European languages, Chinese. We have a lot of Russian, things like that. So if you publish, we will buy. And we think of ourselves as a resource and kind of a kind of a resource of record. And so that's the kind of perspective I'm going to try to bring to the discussion today, as opposed to the authorial.
Thank you so much. So the question that we have to start off really for everyone is, what new trends do you see developing surrounding the publication of African literature and writing, and how do they make you feel? And we are going to start with you, Kenechi.
Okay, so what new trends do we see Well, I think a lot of good is happening in the sense that there is this new boldness African writers have, where people seem to feel energized to write their stories the way they want it to be written, which is a new trend, I think. And of course, there's a whole lot of interest in African literature right now, which I love. There's a whole lot of new magazines springing up, even as of last month, So all of this is a renaissance that I think it's necessary, especially as we or these African writers are now taking back their own story, to express themselves exactly as they want to be expressed in whatever tradition. And that's what I find very encouraging. That's what we also want to platform with our press. If someone wants to be innovative in their writing, if an African writer or someone wants to write in Pidgin English, where do we publish that? That sort of boldness is what I find encouraging, is a trend I see now. On a larger scale, everybody wants to read Africa now, which is good. But once you start looking at it, we want to read Africa, what exactly, where are these write-ups, where are the books from African writers? Which is why it's important that libraries, publishers start putting up these stories for people to see and know where to find it. So I think that's a trend that I find really encouraging. Everybody feels empowered to tell their story without some kind of erasure. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, I was just noticing in the New York Times book review this morning, I was just reading kind of over the table of contents. I was seeing a lot of several African names that I think 10 years ago I wouldn't have seen. Even so, that's kind of on a larger scale like that. But again, at the Herskovits Library, we have a lot of vendors, kind of long-standing vendors who deal with publications from Africa. So we get things kind of on a regular basis. And right now we've got a project where we're slowly, we've had 2 gigantic book cabinets, not bookshelves, but book cabinets full of books in various African languages that have been there for 20, 30, 40 years that have not been cataloged, so no one knew they existed. And so some of these things, like Kenechi said, that people people feel comfortable expressing themselves in Pidgin or whatever, that has been going on. But again, these books had very small runs. Some of them might only exist in a couple of copies. And at least for people here who are researching that kind of stuff, if it's not in our catalog, people don't know that it exists. So we're working through those now to get that out there so people know. And as soon as things show up in our catalog, interlibrary alone just starts to jump. So that's always an encouraging sign. So we'd like to think that we're kind of helping that trend along, kind of jumping in at to show that yes, there is this new excitement in publishing, but there is a history behind it as well. So we like to think that we're just kind of bringing a little more light to that. But definitely we are seeing more of this, more of what you mentioned as well.
Thank you, Gene. Ukamaka.
Yes, I think the trend that I see I see a lot of recklessness and also playfulness in what we are publishing these days, and it makes me so happy. A few years ago, when you ask me what kind of story I want to get out there in the world, I want to look at my family history, I want to look at communal history, I want to look at a bit of trauma, I want to look at the historical influences and all that. And also the danger of all that, even though they were so great, my literary ancestry, the danger there is that most of those work were read as there's this anthropological gaze through which we read them. you pick up a work by an African writer, you're seeing it as a political document. I mean, the body is politics. I mean, we can separate the body from politics, but there's this centering of there's this anthropological gaze, ethnographic gaze through which we interpret African works. It's not seen as a work of art or a work of pleasure or work of love. A few years ago, Qatar Republic, had the Ankara Press, and which I hope will continue to flourish. That they were publishing romance book by, romance book that straddle genres, literary and also the romance. So we now see influx of all that happening. We have Kehinde Fadipe's work that is coming out recently. It's called In Such Tremendous Heat. I want to read that book. We have Bolu Babalola, who is doing amazing things with love, romantic love, and also mythology. We see a lot of writers playing with the genre, refusing categorization. We have Akwekenisi, with the amazing work that they are publishing. They're writing author fiction, they're writing fiction, they're writing poetry, they're writing romance, and even the romance, when you read it, it's almost like straddling both worlds. They resist categorization. So that makes me very excited. Now, when Western publishers, when they pick up our work, you're not seeing it through one particular lens. We see a diversity of stories. We're not just seeing trauma. I mean, trauma is good. I continue to mine my family trauma and also include that in my work. But I also talk about love. I want to talk about love. I want to be playful. I want to weave different strands of my experiences, all these things that came together to form us into our stories. And I see people doing amazing things with that. Recently, I requested for Ore Abaje Williams, the three of us. When you look at there's this very, very sensational dynamic in that story itself. So it's so good, when you talk about African literature, what people are doing. And also, I think bringing it back to Isale magazine, and that's what we're trying to do with Isale magazine. So our current quarterly issue, it's called Hedonism. It's it's like, be hedonistic. What gives you joy? What makes you happy? What gives you pleasure? It's just not, tell us about your pain, tell us about your sorrow. It's like, what makes you happy? What tickles you? Before that, we had the queer issue, we had the woman issue. I mean, we're going all over the place, mining those stories, putting those stories in conversation with people from across the world, because they also submit their work, not just African writers. So putting our experiences, our diversity of stories in conversation with other writers from across the world. So I think it's a very reckless and happy and playful period to exist in as an African writer, and it makes me so happy, really, to be able to go to the library and my library here at USD, I request for book, and I'll have an avalanche of African writers, not just literary fiction, like even speculative fiction. We have Suyo Kumbo doing amazing things. We have Wole, who has a new book coming out, Shigidi. So we have amazing people doing all these things. So it's so good. You can't just look at African literature this day and say it is just about literary fiction. I mean, it's everything, right? And that's the beauty of writing. Thank you.
Just to repeat, Isale magazine is the one that Ukamaka works on. I've shared the spelling of it in the chat. Next question for you all. What challenges have you seen concerning the publication of African literature and writing? For example, African languages, accessibility, funding, sustainability. Gene.
Caught myself there. Since I work in an academic library, the challenges that I've seen primarily firsthand are the challenges of researchers, especially young researchers, being able to actually access the tools that we have available, the primary sources. One thing that COVID actually became good for was that we tried to figure out some long distance solutions. So we purchased a hover cam, a document camera. Between that and Zoom, which allows us to do what we're doing right now, people can, we've got a large collection of, for example, Ajami manuscripts from West Africa. And so we've been able to have people virtually virtually look through some of our manuscripts. Actually, and the camera allows them to look at them in more detail than if they were visiting them in person. because we can zoom in so you can actually like see the grain of the paper and things like that. That was very useful. But one of the big things is, again, if you actually want to spend time in the collection, which is one of the best things to do when you visit the Herskovits Library, because what's great about it is that we have not just rare materials, but we have open stacks. So we have everything from books that were published in the 17th century to the latest tabloids and everything in between. And because we have rare and popular materials, everything can talk to each other. So it's best if people can actually come to the library and wander around and find things that way. So what we've done is we've established and this took years, a travel grant specifically for young researchers from the continent. And I think I'll put this up right, I'll put this in the chat. The newest application deadline is coming up pretty soon. So that's something that we're actively trying to do, because that's a huge hurdle. To get over here, much less spend time here, is not cheap. And more established researchers have the means to do that. But if you're just getting started in your research career, that could be a really, really difficult hurdle. Luckily, if you're a grad student here, you automatically have those resources at hand. But if you're researching somewhere on the continent and you hear about this place, unless you've got some magical access to funds, it's really difficult. So this is something that, again, we've been, my curator and the curator before her were working on this for years and years. But this is something that I think is really helpful to get that. And again, it's just a drop in the bucket, but again, access is important and physical access is best.
Thank you, Gene. Just to reiterate some of the things that Gene was saying, the link that he shared in the chat is an opportunity to access the collections at the Herskovits Library in Evanston, Illinois. So if you're interested in applying, you can click on that link, get the application, and turn in your candidacy soon. Ukamaka, the question was challenges you have seen concerning the publication of African literature.
Yes. Number one is sustainability, right? Without funding, how do you sustain these amazing things that we are doing? Something recently broke my heart. We saw a few magazines packing up on the continent. I'm not going to mention name. And when you look at the history of those magazines, you see that the editors, they put in everything into that magazine, into publishing those work, into editing them, into platforming writers who ordinarily would not have gotten access elsewhere. But then to see those magazines, die because of lack of funding. So it really, I think it's the most bitter challenge for me, especially as an editor of a magazine. What I've been able to do is just to go, sustain the magazine with my stipend, occasionally reach out to people for support, and then having an amazing team of editors who are volunteering without being paid to edit these works, to curate these quarterly issues and the general issues. And writers should be paid for doing the work, and seeing people do all this and not get paid for it. I just wish, I can just flick my fingers and fall into millions of dollars to be able to reward them for the hard work. So that's the major challenge we face as editors of magazines. How do we sustain this? How do we make sure that the magazine will be here in the next 20 years? How do we reach out to people who will help us? Recently, I reached out to a few people. We run the Isale magazine prizes. I reached out to a few friends, and they're able to support the magazine. But for how long will you be able to do that if you don't have institutional backing? Magazines in the past, we've seen them, when they're unable to do that individually, is to reach out to institutions and have the magazines housed in the institution. We have like Transition Magazine, for example, housed at Harvard University, housed there. It's good to have those magazines. It would be nice to have institutional backing for Isale magazine, but then this is something African, this is something that belongs to home. I don't want it housed in an American institution. You know, so that's the major challenge, that sustainability. Without the funding, how do you do that? But something that gives me hope is that we have publishers also who are trying to fill that gap, who have been able to identify that gap. We have like Masobi Books in Nigeria, for example, you know, reaching out. Recently, they made a call. I think it's a call for novellas. So if you can extend your short story for as much as you can, they can publish it in book form and have it distributed all, you know, across Africa. So Masobi Book is doing an amazing thing. I mean, our Nigerian publishers, they're just killing it in the market these days and doing all the best they can to have not just published those books, but also to have those books distributed, to have people read those books. You know, when you go to my Instagram story, you see bookstagrammers, you know, the people who review African book, and it gives me so much joy seeing them reviewing just African books. It makes me so happy. Also recently we have lots of book lists, you know, oh, the next best, you know, the 40 African writers you should read this year. You know, before now we look up to the New York Times, you know, the London Review of Books or the Los Angeles Review of Books to do all that work for us. But our people are feeling all that gap, and it's joy. But then my fear is how do we sustain these amazing things that we are doing? So that's where funding comes into place. Yeah, thank you.
Connection, challenges.
Challenges. Well, of course, the main one, like everyone is saying, like what Oka just said, is sustainability, which has a lot to do with funding. But it's not just funding, you know. But yeah, funding is primary. As a publisher, it is difficult, right? Especially if it's, I mean, I started Iskanchi Press, and the funding is my pay from as a teacher of writing. That's it, you know. So it is, you know, publishing is a business, yes, but there's a vision and a passion, but you can't run with your vision if you don't have funding. How do we get this funding? That's a major problem. There are all kinds of opportunities that don't seem to get to where it's really needed. There's a whole conversation about diversifying the publishing industry, and why is there not a system where Isele Magazine or Iskanchi Press, for instance, can be funded by all of these people, you know, making all of this noise about how they want to diversify the whatever, and they do all of the DEIs. We need funding, yeah, but I am very reluctant to make appeals, but it is it is what it is. And how can we help ourselves? Okay, if we as African writers want to support African literature and all of that, yeah, someone is going to start the publishing house, right? But then someone also needs to buy the books. How are we supporting Isele Magazine? How are we supporting Iskanchi Press? You know, how are we donating to these magazines when they call for donations? What African books, what African publishers are you patronizing? What African bookstores or bookstores that focus on African literature? Who is looking out for them and buying books from them? So funding is key, but I also think in terms of sustainability, how do we keep on going? And I'm thinking about diversifying our kind of writing, or, you know, there's fiction. What about cultural think pieces? There's a whole lot of stories that I think if we put it out there, people are going to buy it or want to read it, and thereby funding will come. You know, people will pay for some of these works. As a Nigerian, there's so many stories that I'm like, this is an opportunity. I think of Bakassi Boys, right? All of that happened and nobody wrote anything about it. Or the Nigerian police going on live TV, national TV, to announce the arrest of a goat, right? A goat accused of stealing something, right? We don't write about it. I can see that movie, right? We're talking about funding. Let's do the work too, you know. It's changing, I agree. But funding needs material, right? And these materials needs to be seen. There's fiction. I'm so glad we're no longer writing fiction about hot and bare-breasted women and people suffering and HIV. We're now writing about romance, people doing things in offices in Lagos, you know. That is good. That is the kind of story that I think people will be interested in. Netflix and all of these movie companies are looking for stories, right? If we are talking about funding, they write a good story, write something that would appeal to people, and thereby, I mean, it would sell. As a publisher, I'm interested in putting out necessary works, but I'm also interested in putting out works that won't sell just 200 copies. Because to keep the vision running, I need to sell books. It's as simple as that. You know, when writers, you know, wonder why we give $500 or $1,000 advance, most of them don't understand that it's from someone's pay, from someone's my pay, you know. And we also have a magazine for unruly, you know, just experimental African writing, where I want to pay writers $50 per piece, which is very small. But again, that's the most I can do, which means I can't go on any vacation, which means imagine all of the stuff I could be doing with money, but there's a vision. So there's just so many ways to look at it. And like as Uka was saying, there is a need for the kind of thing Gene has, you know, that library, archiving and collating stuff. What are African countries doing about stuff like this? What is Nigeria doing about having such a like a resource, like a library of African languages? Why would it be something in Europe? Is it because they have more funds? I don't think so. There's a whole lot of funds in Nigeria, for instance, that is just allocated to all kinds of nonsense. Perhaps they're not aware of the need. You know, I don't know, perhaps we as writers need to remind the government or whoever it is, you know, with the funds, that, hey, you need to support arts and culture. You need to do some more, you need to allocate some more funds for arts and culture. Think about, I mean, we don't have one MFA program in the entire country, Nigeria, not one. That was, yeah, imagine that, right? Or perhaps that might not be a problem, but there's a reason we don't have one, you know? So I think funding it's key, but I don't know, it's everyone has to get involved in it. Buy books where you see, support African writers when they have their readings, go there, you know, buy their books. That's the funding we're talking about.
Okay. More on this. So what types of African voices are not being heard? Uka.
That's an interesting question. So recently, there's this amazing magazine. It's called Olongo Africa, you know, owned by a friend called Atubasun. So I'll write the name of the magazine here. It's called Olongo Africa. On International Mother's Day, they released an anthology of multilingual anthology, you know, of African languages, you know, having stories translated into different African languages. I was listening to some of them. One of the stories was translated to Amaziya. Amaziya is one of the languages. It's from Morocco, right? The native Moroccan, you know. So one of the stories was translated in that, and it was so fascinating for me, you know, me listening to it, having been to Morocco in 2017, and you know, seeing the cultural, like I call it, the cultural colonization happening there. You know, we have the French, we have the Spanish, we have the English, you know, we have the Arabic, you know, jostling for space in Morocco, and then the native language, Amazigh, is right behind it. We also have the creolized Arabic, which they call Derija, and then seeing one of the stories translated into that language was so fascinating for me. So what do I see? The stories that I see not being told, I think what my response would be the absence or the lack or the gap or the rarity of African languages, you know, our own stories translated into those languages, into various African languages. It would be so nice to have that. A few months ago, I had this dream of an anthology of African languages, having our stories translated, but the work going back to funding, you know, because you have to pay the translators. This time you're not asking for volunteers, you have to pay them to do that rigorous work, you know. So I couldn't bring it to fruition because of lack of funding. So, and something else also that I find interesting that I see bubbling up, because one of my major research focus is, you know, literary representations of motherhood, you know, in our stories. And I see, before now we had like Buchia Mecheta and writing The Joys of Motherhood, writing about motherhood, you know, and ambition. We had Florama writing a full. I mean, we also have Amata Edu. We had Zainab Al-Khali writing Stillborn. So we had this entire generation of women, you know, looking at motherhood, centering motherhood in stories. At the time, they sort of like were a bit of silence, not silence really, but that influx that we had a few years, many years ago, you know, almost like disappeared within our own climb. But now we see many people returning to that theme of motherhood. One of the criticisms that pisses me off, you know, it's this idea that writing about writing about the body, it's subordinate to, you know, because, you know, it's not seen as serious literature. It's often dismissed as domestic fiction, especially when you write it in fiction. And the idea for that, or will I say, or the criticism, you know, came from this idea that the feminine is emotional and while the masculine is, you know, logical, you know, it's intellectual. So all the artistic productions about the body are often seen as subordinate to the intellectual, you know. So, but then we see a lot of women pushing back against that, you know, advocating for writings about the body. We see that with Melissa Febos, you know, in her latest craft book called Body Work. You know, it's like, tell me your story about your body, advocating for that, pushing back, and also doing that rigorous work. You also see that in Rachel Cox's, you know, A Life's Work, you know, in which she wrote about motherhood, pregnancy, childbirth, all that, you know, the split, you know, in womanhood, how motherhood changes someone, but also doing rigorous work of analyzing critical texts and even academic texts and theories within that same body of work. So it gave me so much joy seeing, you know, reading and seeing women returning to that theme. You know, a few years ago, we had Ayobami Adebayo writing Stay With Me. You know, recently we have Chika Onigwe's The Middle Daughter that is coming out. Please buy that book. Chika Onigwe's The Middle Daughter. It's no, I'm going to write it. It's incredible. One of the most fascinating things I've read in recent time. So these are the stories that I'm so deeply interested in. Stories that explore the body, stories that talk about motherhood, stories that do not shy away from that categorization of domestic fiction. So that's what I am deeply interested in, and that's what I ache for more in our literary landscape. Thank you.
Kenechi, what types of voices are not being heard?
Part of the vision for launching Iskanchi Press was to platform some of these voices, because most people, the average reader, knows about, you know, Nigerian literature. They've read Chimamanda, they've read some books by Nigerian authors and South African writers. What about writers from Chad? You know, Chad is still an African country. What kind of stories is being told in that region? What Mauritania and all of these other countries that we don't often see in the news? For me, those are the kind of works I wanted to highlight. So, like, the first book we actually acquired was by Musa Ebno from Mauritania. He wrote a science fiction, just amazing book. But how would he be heard? Who's going to publish a work that was originally written in Arabic and then translated into French? It didn't exist in English, you know, until someone, Maribeth Timmerman, translated it. But for me, it was such a beautiful piece of work, and it's coming from Mauritania. Like, I had to look up that country, and oh yeah, actually, wow, they do have writers here. So I'm interested in books like, not from the usual, you know, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. What about all of these other 54 African countries? They all have stories, and some of them are writing in different, you know, different languages. The other book we acquired was, I think we're launching it in Washington, D.C. at the Mexican Embassy, but it was written in Portuguese and just translated to English. So works like that are, you know, if we are interested in expanding the worldview, you know, we need all of these voices, and who's gonna publish it? So that's why I like what we're doing with the platforms. I like there's a whole lot of people coming up, you know, in terms of magazines and all of that. I for one want to publish some of the stories I had growing up in Nigeria. You know, some of the Nigerian English is making waves now, good. Pidgin English, I want to have a book written in Pidgin English and not have some editor be like, well, no one is going to read it. I think people would love to read that. I would love to read it. And in terms of voices, there are stories that like I said, I think it's just being wasted. You know, this whole idea of someone coming in and telling your story, right? Sometimes it's because we did not tell that story. You know, I'm thinking of all of the things that suddenly some researcher from Oxford University, some graduate student is going to come to Nigeria and discover stuff. We are looking at this stuff, we've been looking at it, we didn't see it. And then they come, they write about it, it makes a lot of waves. And here we go on social media saying, yeah, we are being taken advantage of. I know how painful that is, you know, but it also because perhaps we need to start telling our own stories, you know, just, I keep thinking about all of the, who's writing the story about the Queen of the Coast? Who is the Queen of the Coast? We don't know. But if you say that in Nigeria, everybody knows what you're talking about. Where are the stories on some of these cultural think pieces, some of these cultural foundations we have as a people? You know, I was talking about Bakassi boys. And again, the first question I was asked when I came to University of Utah by my professor, you know, as per introduction, hi, your name is Kenechi. Tell me, is it true that the Nigeria police arrested a goat? I said, yes, but that was all I could say. Yes. That immediately I knew there's a lot missing. There's just a lot of material we can get from that. I want to interview that goat, right? I want to interview this police commissioner, whoever it is. So many stories like that. So if we're talking about what kind of voices are not being heard, yes, stories that are, you know, what does it mean to be alive in Nigeria, in Kenya right now? It's not about post-colonial stories about huts and whatever, people suffering. What is it? What is going on in your lives? You know, I think we put out Iskanchi Press put out a call for manuscripts, and we emphasized on reading stories by women above 50. It is great to be a 25-year-old debut writer with your wonderful, you know, work, but I want to read these women with experience, women past 50, 60, 70 years old, you know, what stories can they, I mean, there's a whole lot of experience behind all of that, all they are. And the publishing industry doesn't seem to be interested in that. Everyone wants to read this young, wonderful, you know, brainiac. But I want to read the Sephiatas of the world. I want to read people who are you know, who, I don't know how to put it, but these are the voices I, as a publisher, I'm looking for, right? I will publish the 19-year-old if they write a good work. But I also want to read about this 65-year-old woman. This is her first foray into writing. She's based in Kano, and you know, she's never been out of the country, but she has this wonderful book. Those are the kind of voices I think I personally will want to read more of.
Gene, what types of voices are not being heard?
It's kind of hard to follow, Uka and Kenechi after those stories, because I mean, they've got firsthand knowledge of this stuff. For me, this again, working in the Herskovits for the past 8 years, I'm a bibliophile, and I love working in our rare book rooms. And at first, I was just gobsmacked. We have all these old books, It's just beautiful to look at them. But the longer I work with them, the more I realize that there's a whole lot missing in those old books. The voices that are not there are more important than the voices that are there. And they're practically unrecoverable for all kinds of reasons. One of the things that, one of the kinds of research that people tend to use from our academic archives are interviews that scholars in like the mid 20th century had done, and these were again primarily white researchers going to different places and interviewing people and trying to get their stories. And with varying degrees probably of success. I mean, I'm not qualified to judge that, but I'm sure that there's always going to be there's always going to be questions of authenticity, whether it's transcription or just basic understanding, because a turn of phrase might mean something very different from the person who's speaking than it is to the person who's recording. But at the same time, those interviews have become very popular for researchers trying to get a sense of what has been lost or what was never recorded by the people themselves at the time. And that, for me, really is the voices that were not heard because there was no opportunity for them to be recorded. And again, all those old books, it's always the white man's view of what's going on. Occasionally, we've actually started to buy diaries of like the wives of diplomats and things like this, and you get slightly different opinions of official versions of events. But again, that's like the tiniest, like 5-degree different version of events. But it's just kind of hurtful. It's just painful to realize that there's so much that is not there, and research can only take you so far when you only have a part of the story there. So the more, like you say, the more of recording these, like you said, the story of the police and the goat, which you keep coming back to, like eventually, if that doesn't get written down, no one will know that story. But things that seem to be either everyday or, well, everybody knows it, we don't need to write it down, eventually that becomes lost also. I think the more things that get written down, the better. And again, it's again, I just lament the fact that so much has not been written down before.
So on that note, what is the role of libraries and archives in collecting and preserving African literature and writing?
Oh, good. I'll jump right back in then. Again, it's interesting because again, we're in the United States versus on the continent. And Kenechi, you brought this up earlier, like why here as opposed to there. Again, we started the library itself here was established in the 1950s, but it was started by Melville J. Herskovits, who came to Northwestern in the 1930s to start the anthropology program. And it started from his own personal research library. So this starts before the 1960s, before the long 1960s, before independence movements. So we have and he was collecting voraciously for all these things. So he has things that, and therefore our library has things that were destroyed in home countries. We have a lot of people from different places on the continent who come here because, especially for government documents that no longer exist in their place of origin, and I mean, it's great that they still exist somewhere. It would be nice if they could exist where they came from, but it's simply because of history, because of government violence. Sometimes these things disappear, but it's not just government violence. I just got a request like 3 days ago from a woman who's asking about a pamphlet that her husband's father had published in like 1983. So we're not talking ancient history at all. We're not talking a million years ago. And it was published, and she's asking us if we'd be able to allow her to get her husband to read this because her husband never saw the thing that her father published. It's a 12-page document. And and she realized that we had a copy, and I did lots and lots of searching, and as far as I can tell, we are the only place. The only other mention of it on the internet is in somebody's PhD dissertation, but there's no other copy listed in any library or any books. No bookseller has a copy of it. And this is 1983. And this was not like, it's not something that was like published in mimeograph. This was an actual published document, like offset printing and everything like that. We just happen to have it. It's bizarre. Things will disappear. You know, like I said, it's a question of distribution. It's a question of who decides what to keep and what is ephemeral. It's a political document, so that sometimes those have shorter lifespans, anyways. But still, it's like, really, this is the only one that's left. There's probably some somewhere in somebody's drawer, back dresser drawer or something like that. But this is not something from the 19th century. This is something from our lifetime. And it was just shocking to me that we were the only ones that had it. And so for us, unlike a public library where you're always weeding the collection because you want to keep the things that are the most popular, for an academic library, we don't weed, we don't get rid of things once they're worn out or they're no longer popular. We keep and keep and keep and keep. So we're always running out of space. But so it's collecting and preserving, and preservation is a huge aspect of that. So our best friends in the library, well, again, the Herskovits Library is a small unit, but we need everybody else in the building. And the people who work in preservation and conservation are the best people in the world, because they will take something that mice have gotten to, or mold has gotten to, or that was stapled, or heaven forbid somebody put tape on, and they can rescue that thing and keep it legible forever and stable, so that people can come to it over and over. And I think that's we want, because we never know what's going to be useful. We will buy things we don't know why necessarily. When Barack Obama was elected president, we discovered, I wasn't even there at the time, but they discovered just in our miscellaneous files a booklet that President Obama's father had written in 1953, like an educational pamphlet for children. Who knew at the time that would become something that people would be really, really interested in? But suddenly it was, and now that lives in a safe instead of in an open file case.
Thank you, Gene. Uka, the question was, what is the role of libraries and archives in collecting and preserving African literature and writing?
Yes, thank you so much for the point you raised, Gene. Talking about things disappearing, from the archive. This is something I had. I didn't know how insidious it was until I moved to the United States, back home, to get access to certain books or even theses and dissertation. I couldn't even find them. You couldn't possibly go online to my higher institution where I graduated in Nigeria and find, maybe collection of all the dissertation and thesis, written certain period. You can't even find them. You don't have access to them. You have to physically go to the university library, and then ask. But then you have to ask if you know what you're looking for, right? Ordinarily, you just use a keyword when you go to, say, academic search Premier. You enter with a keyword, and then it gives you, result of possible things to search for. So we didn't have that. And then moving to the United States for me, and realizing that my university can get me materials from the UK, from the frigging UK, for example. I'm sorry, I'm using the F word. From getting that, it was so exciting, but it was also very saddening for me. So we have lots that are lost, in this institution, lots that people, my friends at home could make use of, but they don't have access to them. The other time I was suggesting to a friend who works at my higher institution back at home, why don't you upload these materials to ProQuest, for example, so that people can look them up, and have access to them and know that you have these materials. If not, they'll just be collecting dust at home. And the response was the fund to be able to do all this, to execute all this. It's a complicated thing. And so the role for me, I see people trying to, fill that gap in the way they can, like Olongo Africa that I mentioned recently, that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Recently, they republished a book by Olabisi Ajala. So Olabisi Ajala wrote this amazing traveler called An African Abroad. He traveled with his Vespa, different countries, and the book was published in the 60s, and then it disappeared from conversation. Nobody was talking about it. And this amazing friend of mine, Kalato Person, who runs Olongo Africa, now had to go and rescue that work, and now it's back into circulation. So that's something beautiful, the way we can continue to preserve those materials so that they don't disappear. The other time I was looking up African mythology or things on African or even Igbo divinity, and the friend Kasima recommended John a book by Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is like a native doctor, but he's also a professor. He was an academic. So his name is John Anenechukwu Ome. So he wrote this book called After God is Dibia. Now, this book was published in the UK. It's no longer accessible. You can't find it. You can't buy it on Amazon. You can't buy it anywhere. To get this book, you have to pay close to $400. What I now did, and my friend told me that the person she bought the book from holds this book, like won't even give it out because it's so rare. Now, when you read this particular work, the writer, this academic, not only documented Igbo divinity system, but it's also Igbo origin story, even Igbo divinity, Igbo Afa, what we call Igbo Afa, the various ways, the role, and even the gender roles, broke down all this, and even down to medicine and music and healing and even sexuality, all of that in this particular work. Nobody knows about this book until someone tells you about it. Now, to get it, you have to go through the UK publisher. Now, what did I do? Because I'm in the US, I had to get my university here. They borrowed the book for me. They had to borrow for me to read. Now, imagine what is lost at home. This man is from Southeastern Nigeria. This book is not available where we are. My own people can even get that. And which leads me to my next point. It's a conversation that it's a very important and difficult conversation that African writers should have. Now, when we are signing our rights to Western publishers, we should try to retain our African rights. Because what happens is that when you sign out, give away their world rights, they pay you good money for it. There's tendency for the work going out of print. And when it goes out of print, your people do not have access to them. So how do you archive this thing, your contribution to your community? It's lost. And then when you have like a publisher Nigerian publisher, Masobe Books, for example, trying to buy, sub-right for this, like the Nigerian right to have it published so that we can have copies of them at home. Libraries can stock them. They are put through hell. And I don't even want to take us like drive off a tangent. They are put through hell just to acquire the Nigerian rights of a book by a Nigerian writer. In fact, at a particular point, I don't want to mention houses, they refuse to sell that right to a Nigerian publisher. They would rather print copies themselves and ship it to you to sell, like your book distributor. So you can imagine the level of disrespect happening. But the writers themselves they don't know what is happening. You have to go into the nitty-gritty of the business for you to be able to understand what is happening. So a lot is lost. If your book goes out of print, you don't have copies of your book at home. How will your local libraries, your home-based libraries, how will they stock those books if they don't have access to them, if they don't have the Nigerian publisher publishing the Nigerian version of this particular work? So it's such a very tenuous, cobwebby kind of conversation because it goes various ways. even while we are advocating for us to have rights to our own book and have them published at home, but also funding at home to be able to stock those books in the libraries, to be able to also, even the ones we have, to be able to have access to them, for a student to be able to go online, Google John Anenechukwu, or Igbo Divinity System and have books, have access to those books at home without, going to the UK. At the other time, I was working on this historical fiction, and I read an essay, a critical essay by this academic called Jenny Dagas. She has done amazing work on Igbo women and religion, especially interrogating the role of CMS, that's the Anglican Commission in 1800s, 1900s Nigeria. And she made reference to a diary by Samuel Ajayi Crowther, one of the first, Nigerian missionaries from Southwestern Nigeria. And then I was trying to get access to this, the diary itself, and it's housed, I think it's at Birmingham University in the UK. You can have access, my university can borrow it. For me to read that diary, I have to travel to the UK, sit in the library, read it. I can't even take pictures of it. So you see a lot, that archiving. Yes, it's preserved there, but what about home? So there's a huge gap here that it's so complicated to be able to untangle all of that in one sitting. Thank you.
Kenechi, the question again is, what is the role of libraries and archives in collecting and preserving African literature and writing?
I agree with a lot that Ukamaka has said so far. It's just the exploitation of African writing and African text it's crazy. Because now that I'm involved now as a publisher, there's so many things, like I've been saying, that I want to see out there. So many books we read growing up. I'm thinking of page setters, right? Or some of the books that they just don't exist anymore. And okay, as a publisher, I'm looking to acquire this right. Sometimes either you can't even find who owns the rights, or it's owned by some very British organization or library where they can't even, or publisher that, like Ukamaka said, is just a whole lot of stress to acquire the rights. I remember when I was working in a library in Lagos, Nigeria, to stock the library, there's so many books that we couldn't find in Nigeria, books written by Nigerians. We had to import these books. They didn't exist in Nigeria, right? So it is a problem of, one, our cultural investment in Nigeria or in Africa needs to be more than what it is. We need to have some of these archives, right, in the continent. For instance, when I was at university here in Utah, right, I was in a class. I can't remember what that class was, but this white professor, I don't know what she was talking about, how African literature or African writing, there's been this erasure of, that Africans didn't have ancient forms of writing. And then she was like, for instance, Kenechi, in your country, the Insibidi writing, and I was like, the what? I never heard of it. I never heard of this writing, but I got to learn about it here in Utah by this white lady, wonderful woman. So I am a Nigerian, grew up in Nigeria, never heard of this. And it's not because I'm that ignorant, right? Because I called home and like, hey, do you know about this, something called Insibidi? We're like, yeah, what about it? I'm like, what do you mean, what about it? I need to know more. Where are the scripts? Who has this? Where can I find it? Looking online, you find nothing. So for me as a publisher, we need money. Because some of these things it's not for sale, right? Some of these things you need money to be able to do some of these works of passion. I want to have the Insibidi scripts somewhere, or a story on Insibidi. Even if nobody buys it, it exists. That's the point. It's archived somewhere, not, you get to learn about it when you go to some dusty library and they'll be like, yeah, we have this book on Igbo witchcraft. Or I'm like, who? Some of these wonderful stories. Again, like I keep saying, some grad student from Oxford or Cambridge will go to Nigeria and do the research and take the work back, and you never hear about it until somehow, like Kuka was saying, you're doing some kind of research on your own country, something about your nation, and it doesn't exist in your country. Nobody even knows about it. So the Insibidi writing for me was a shock. Like, who knew? And then I asked around people who grew up with me and people I know in Nigeria, most of us never heard of it. So it's a problem of cultural negligence. I don't know if it is that we don't care or if it is that there needs to be more funding. Again, everything boils down to funding, but sometimes I don't think it's funding, because some of us, if we take an interest in it, we can do some of these things. We can archive some of this work. We can, I mean, I started a press. If I can start a press, I mean, why are other people not doing it? Of course, I have to take extra jobs and all of that to keep it running. But I think the passion for this archiving is important. And I like what Gene is doing. He's not the, I mean, his organization is not the only one doing some of this, but it boils down to what kind of collaboration do we have on the continent? You know, we talk about, there's a whole lot of stolen materials, a lot of, yeah, so many of our, you know, cultural arts and what have been stolen, and we can't have access to it except we go to some British museum and stuff like that. But in Africa itself, how are we making sure that we preserve this stuff? We preserve our art, we preserve some of these languages. So many languages are going out of, you know, no one else is speaking it. So yeah, I'm reading Oka's chat. The silence around CBD can be traced to Chris. Yes, that is true. Because I had, yeah, that's, you know, it's occultic. I'm like, how is it occultic? I don't care. Whatever it is, that is something of, and it's Igbo. I am Igbo, you know. This is a writing of, I mean, my first degree was in philosophy, and we were so pissed off where, you know, Africans didn't have any, you know, ancient form of writing, and then people would talk about Egypt, you know, and the cuneiform and all of that. If I knew that we hadn't seen it, that would have been a great conversation in that class, you know, go like, hey, excuse me, we do have stuff like this, and here it is, you can find it here. But it doesn't exist. Thanks to Katrina Coleman in University of Utah that told me about it, about my own ancient language. And I don't know whose fault that would be, who to be offended with or who should be angry about. But yeah, so libraries are the saving grace because they can archive some of these things, but we do need to have organization. I don't even know the state of Nigerian museums. What kind of art forms do we have in there? I don't know. It is a problem. And I think we are getting there. I don't like to always sound negative, but all of this, the fact that we're even having this conversation is that progress is being made. People are thinking about it, which is I don't think is what is the norm. So we start by thinking about it, and we start by, you know, doing something about it. I'm doing something about it. Ukamaka is doing something about it. Kola Tubosun, Oris, and so many other people that I know are doing something about preserving, you know, some of these works that are very necessary and that could go missing if they're not already missing right now. So yeah, I think there's hope.
Well, on that note about doing something about it, this is our last question broadly to the panel before we open it up to the attendees for questions and answers. In what ways can writers, publishers, researchers, and librarians collaborate to enhance the visibility of African literature? Kenechi, you're up.
Oh. It's again what we're doing, you know, and it's some of these conversations we've had it, and it boils down to taking action. So as a publisher, to be very, very basic, you know, as a publisher, how do I champion the cause of the writers that, you know, that submit their work to me? To the press? How do we make sure that these writers survive? So if we're talking about how to encourage writing, or how we can make enhance the visibility of African literature, it's when we do have this African texts, what do we do with it? You know, how do we reward the producers of this art? Because it is even for writers, you need to survive. And okay, at Iskanchi Press, we are very interested in experimental writing. But experimental writing, you know, innovative work sometimes takes 10 years, 15 years. I'm thinking about some of the works we studied at the University of Utah under, you know, experimental fiction. It took some of these people 15 years to do this work. Now, what African writer has the luxury of spending 15 years on a work? Who's going to pay the school fees? Who's going to, and all of that? So it's still, again, a whole lot of conversation about funding, but as a publisher, what kind of advances, what kind of royalties, what kind of percentage are we offering writers to encourage them to like, hey, I can survive by just doing this, so I can put all my energy into creating art because I'm being paid for it, I'm being rewarded for it. So I think as a publisher, that's one area I think I can come in sense of championing these works to the best of our ability and making sure the writers are rewarded for their work. And then, of course, in collaboration with researchers, I also, as a publisher, there are kind of things I want to read, the kinds of works that I need to, I think it's necessary. Cultural pieces about, what it means to exist as a Nigerian. I'm thinking about the whole concept of human trafficking, how it's been looked at from just a scientific and forensic way of how to stop this crime. But there's a whole lot of spiritual element, a whole lot of cultural element attached to this that I think someone should write about. The whole, initiations going in, because we can't solve some of these problems if we're just looking at it in a scientific way, right? But what else do we have? There's no one writing about cultural pieces to break down the foundations of why this is not ending, why no one can rat out their madams, and why this, Yahoo boys, so there's just so much I can't even begin to talk about it, where this collaboration of researchers going to the streets, writing something that a publisher can help promote. That way it is a collaboration, both the writer and the publisher. You do the work, the publisher promotes it and puts it out there so that it doesn't, disappear. So there's just a lot that can be done. And we do need more research. We do need more literary criticism, for instance. Everyone is interested in fiction. What about nonfiction? So it's not all on the publisher, it's also the writers, but I think writers are doing more. We need more publishing houses. And these publishers need to offer good advances, reasonable advances at least. So I can't speak of the librarians because Gene is here, he can talk about that. Yeah, so magazines, how much pieces are you paying your writers? I can only pay $50 per piece because that's, I need to survive on my own, but funding, this is the only way we can help.
Uka, in what ways can writers, publishers, researchers, and librarians collaborate to enhance the visibility of African literature?
Yes, this has given me a lot to think about. Now I think I'm going to go back to that's multilingual projects, of collaborating with translators and having our stories translated into various languages. And it's going to be very tasking financially. But that's one way to collaborate, to be able to preserve the work we're doing, but also to not just preserving, but also to transmit it to different audience. And also when I think of collaboration, I'm thinking about the work the amazing, investigative journalist and writer Kiki Modi is doing. She did the documentary, or she headlined the documentary Sex for Grade, which investigated how young students in African universities, especially West African universities, Nigeria, Ghana, for example, how they have been exploited by their instructors, sexually exploited for grades by the instructors. So these are stories that often you read in, pamphlet or stories, or you hear on social media, where you see people doing that work, that very risky, dangerous work of going on the street and investigating these stories and writing about them and then documenting them and making them into film. So these are some of the ways, but then for Kiki Modi to be able to do that amazing work, she and the team, they had the support of BBC, so this is where funding also comes in. But it's also very encouraging to see, what Gene is doing with, the Melvin Herskovits Library of African Studies Research Grant, to knowing that this is a possibility. I'm going to share this with my network, to have people also apply to this. It would be incredible to be able to have funding. So when I think of collaboration, I'm thinking of even institutional support like Gene is doing. I'm thinking of Jenny Dagas, who is able to come from, I think she came from Johns Hopkins that time and then went to Southeastern Nigeria and lived there for a while to be able to ask those questions, visit all those places, document them, write critical analysis, of the impact of Christian colonization, British colonization and religion on the sexual life of Southeastern Nigerian women and how that shaped what motherhood is. So when you have that kind of fund, you're able to do that work. Now, for me as a publisher, what will I be able to do? For me, because I am a student and I am poor, what I can do is dedicate time. It's also to reach out to people who can volunteer that time. One of them is here. One of our associate editors is here, Chidera Ike, amazing editor. I just want to give her a shout out because she gives everything for the magazine, like everything. Dedicate her time. I have to give her flowers. So when you have people like this supporting your managing editor, like Tracy, people taking their time out of their daily work to do this thing, to document our work, to edit our work, to have them published, to have them transmitted. The only promise I have is that SLM Magazine is going to be there in the next 100 years. I mean, it's more than me, right? It's to dedicate, even if I sell a book, is what, my mom will always tell me, Ukamaka, pay your tithes, when you get money, take 10% and go to the church and pay. I agree, I'm going to do that, but SLM is my tithe, right? So when I get a funding, I dedicate like 10% out of my own little money to Isele, so that I know that in the next 10 years, I will not run out of hosting space. I'll be able to pay for web hosting, so it will still be there. I'm able to pay for the link, the name itself, to keep sustaining it, to be able to allocate that money and have it in my little bank account and know that in the next 10 years, Isele is not going to go out of service. It's going to be there. So all I now need to do is to keep looking for volunteers, as much as I can do until we have that institutional support. So, collaborating with people who love this work, until we get the funding that we need. And also something else that we're looking at is to collaborate with established writers, to host masterclasses, for free, but we'll get institutional support, because something I often see is writers, emerging writers at home needing that support. My friend Brisije, I think Brisije is still here, was running, has this amazing platform called Writivism. Writivism championed a lot of voices. One of them is Bemi Aguda, who has 2 books coming out, from nothing, so people doing this thing, because they love it, because they want to preserve our culture, want to preserve our literary ancestry, then they have to dedicate time, money, efforts, talking to people. So that's the future I see for myself, not just as an academic or writer, but as a publisher. That's the future I see, and I hope we will flourish. We'll keep flourishing. Thank you.
In what ways can writers, publishers, researchers, and librarians collaborate to enhance the visibility of African writing?
Well, first of all, what both of my other panelists have said, both of those were great. I'll mention one specific thing that we're tangentially involved with. It's something called the African Poetry Digital Portal. Let me throw the URL in our chat here. This is the project that's based out of the University of Nebraska, but one of the lead researchers is Chris Abani, who's a professor of English at Northwestern and also the head of our program of African Studies. And the Herskovits Library is assisting with this project. And what part of this project is just going through a lot of like obscure periodicals and finding poems that were published in these obscure periodicals by African authors, and they're all going into an online database. And so these poems that probably maybe 15, 20 people saw when they were first published because they were in very, very small run publications are going to get a global audience. If you take a look at that website, at the very bottom of the page, you will see that it is sponsored by the Ford Foundation, which comes back to what everybody has said over and over again. It's about funding, because this kind of work does not come cheap. We hired a special We hired a graduate, we had a student worker who's been doing the bulk of the grunt work, and this is only like a small part of this huge project. But he's been going through periodical after periodical, just looking for poems and scanning those to get those off to this. It's a great idea. It's going to be an amazing resource. But again, this is because a group of poets got together with academics and libraries and money to get something like this going. And so this is, again, it's a historical project, but this is going to give us a great, a new kind of corpus of poetry that people just have not had the opportunity to experience before. So this is one concrete example, I think, of something that fulfills the criteria of the question. But I think that will be really, really interesting once it's up and running. But again, with these projects, I don't know what the timeline is, but there may be more information about that on the website.
So I'm going to give you a brief applause here, and then we're going to stop the recording so that we can take questions from the people physically here in the audience and people virtually in the room as well. Thank you so much for your interventions and your feedback thus far. We're going to go ahead and hit stop on that.